Welcome, everyone, to our next session, which is really focusing on the art of a customer-centric leader. You know, throughout the CCW Fall program, we've spoken a lot about great ideas and new technologies and specific initiatives that can really empower you to create a more customer-centric environment. But the truth is they can all begin and end with depending on whether you have the right leadership in place. And I hate to be accusatory, but since many of you are technically leaders within your contact centers and customer experience functions, a lot of this burden is going to fall on your shoulders to make sure that you are setting your organization up for success. Leaders are important for setting the vision for the customer experience, but they also set the tone. No matter what they say, agents, employees, the rest of the team, even customers are going to be looking at what the leader actually does, whether they really live up to that message that they're trying to promote, whether the practices they initiate are consistent with this so-called vision of customer centricity. If both the vision and the actual tone and the actual behavior do not signal the importance of customer centricity, you're going to bottleneck the organization. It's going to come through to your employees and in turn come through to your customers. And so it's absolutely essential to start to make sure that you are kind of demonstrating the proper customer-centric leadership behaviors. We recently tackled this topic in an article on CCW Digital with one of our top 50 influencers of the year. He also heads up the customer experience consultancy, and that's Ian Golding. And he's going to be our panelist today, really walking through those signs of customer-centric leaders. Ian, how is everything?
Hi, very good. Thank you, Brian. It's lovely to speak to you.
It's great to speak with you as well, and I think that, you know, again, we've done so much right now, and we've seen leadership really come into play because there are shifts happening inside the contact center and customer experience spaces. There, you know, not only is the customer experience a more pivotal part of the business, but the way organizations are interacting with customers is changing. And in order to really make good on that change, in order to ensure that you're ahead of the curve, it's really going to hinge on having great leaders. So I can't wait to walk through some of those 6 steps, 6 signs today, and I think it's going to be a great discussion. But I want to start, you know, at the bottom, because, you know, one of the things about this conversation is that if we're talking about 6 signs of a customer-centric leader, we're kind of already implying the person is a leader. But I want to take a step back before that, and what are some signs as someone just enters your organization, whether they're on the front line or maybe in a junior management role, that they really have the potential to ever become a great customer-centric leader? What do you look for? How do you know which ones are the ones to watch for major developments down the road?
So it's a fantastic question to open with, Brian. And in fact, if I contextualize it by saying that many people will ask me, is customer experience and the focus on it more sustainable if it is top-down or driven top-down or bottom-up? And interestingly, when an organization is looking to bring someone into its business and it has an intention to be customer-centric, what is it looking for in that person in the first place? And too often what we see is that organizations obsess with trying to determine what we call technical competence. Are they able to do the job? But what they fail to look for, often enough, is organizational clarity. In other words, they know why they're doing the job in the first place. And so what I would be looking for in any customer-focused leader is that they don't just have the understanding of the work that is required, but that they are very clear in their understanding of the reason why the business does it in the first place. A very clear sense of purpose and a very good understanding of people. That's sort of my opening shot, if you like.
And that's absolutely key. I think we often talk about training the why as opposed to the what or the how. Really, what is the reason that this is actually happening, not just why are you doing this? Because, or sorry, not just what are you doing, but why are you doing it? Because without that sense of importance, without understanding the significance, it's hard for the agent to really ascribe the proper stakes. It's hard for them to sort of make creative decisions on their own. And obviously, if they can't make those decisions on the front line, it's going to be hard for them to sort of inform others on how to make those decisions when they become leaders down the road.
And that's why, actually, just to add to it, Brian, one of the first questions I would always ask anyone who joins a company, and by the way, I'm using the word leader as a generic term for anyone, because in my opinion, everyone is a leader in their own right. What I would want to know is how they felt about their interaction with the brand before they came to their interview or their meeting. And it's a brilliant question to ask someone, because around 40% of the time, the person hasn't even tried to interact with the brand that they're looking to come and work with.
Yeah, and that's an absolutely interesting fact right there. And I think that, one of the things that we're actually putting out at CCW Digital, a special report on the future of CX employees, and really looking at the importance of brand affinity and brand awareness is absolutely a huge part of what it takes, I think, to really become the kind of agent, become the kind of leader who can connect with customers and not just support them. That connection's key. Now, when we talk about the idea of cultivating leadership skills, because obviously, if it comes down to understanding the why, then when these people that are on the front line right now become executives, become managers within the business, they're going to need to know how to teach that why. They're going to need to know how to ingrain that culture in future frontline agents. And so what can you start to do right now to, when you identify someone as a potential leader, make sure that they're sort of progressing in that direction, that they're not just there kind of doing their job, but that there is a trajectory for them where they can develop these skills, develop this philosophical awareness, and become stronger leaders down the road?
Yeah. I think from my experience of working in many different countries, in many different continents around the world, is that there is this disconnection between being able to achieve numbers and the financial performance that the business is asking for, and for a leader to combine that with a holistic understanding of the environment within which that is going to be enabled. And what I mean by that is that any customer-focused leader must have a brilliant ability to empathize with people, not just the customer, but as importantly, if not more importantly, with colleagues, both peers, superiors, and subordinates. And to be a customer-centric leader, what I would want to see as a core part of the development of that person is their desire to learn, their desire to know what it feels like to do what their colleagues do, the desire to want to put themselves in the shoes of their employees and put themselves in the shoes of the customer. They must not fear learning and getting it wrong. They must not have any sense that by putting themselves into the shoes of others, it's going to blow up in their face. And in addition to that, what I would want to see is that their development is driven as much through collaboration with others as it is through their own individual learning.
Now, the role of the contact center is changing, and I think you hit on the importance of really being able to connect and understand the why. And this kind of become a cliche almost at this point, but what everyone talks about is, as you have self-service becoming more intelligent, as you have digital channels becoming more accessible, they're going to handle the transactional, the simple matters, the predictable, what's my balance, when do I pay my bill, those kinds of questions. The agent's going to be much more about, I think, the nuanced, unpredictable, connection-oriented matters. And so with the contact center agent changing, with the role that they have changing, I'm wondering how that affects the leader, because now obviously the leader, in theory, has to coach these agents to a deeper connection that they may not be right now equipped to actually achieve, as opposed to just kind of assigning them scripts and making sure that they can talk on the phone properly.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think that where leaders in the contact center industry need to be focusing is not the fact that their empires are possibly going to shrink, but more to change the perception of what a contact center can do for the entire organization. Yes, a contact center sits at various points of the end-to-end customer journey, and there will always be a transactional element of what they do. But actually, I think often a missed opportunity for leaders within the contact center space is that their people, their processes are an invaluable source of fact-based information that can help the whole business understand what's working and what isn't working. too often the contact center is blamed for the things going wrong, when actually the reality is far different to that. They are a hugely important source of information that can help to identify the root cause of the problem from every single part of the end-to-end customer journey. And really what contact center leaders should be doing is coming up with better ways of interpreting the information they're receiving to help and guide their colleagues in other parts of the journey.
And that, I think that shift in mindset is so valuable. I think, obviously we've had the point where the contact center is embraced as more than a cost center. That discussion happened decades ago. We kind of get that now.
Yes.
But now I think it's about really understanding all the value it can provide, all the opportunities to really learn what's truly going on in the experience and make sure that that's being funneled upward into the organization so they make the changes. It's not just about maybe by virtue of satisfying the customer, they'll add some value that way. That's kind of an old world way of thinking. Now it is just by virtue of interacting, just by virtue of housing those conversations with customers, what wealth of information can the contact center agent provide for the business?
Because contact center leaders actually will be able to unlock the key to not just improving customer perception, but also saving the organization a huge ton of money. And really, what I often say to a contact center leader, when was the last time you sat down with the board of directors or the C-suite and discuss with them the proportion of calls that are coming in to the business related to different subjects? Why are people phoning the business? What is it that's causing that demand? And not often enough are people actually doing that. Ultimately, the contact center is such a critical part of that end-to-end journey. Leaders have got to get that message out there and continuously share fact and information with the business, not to beat the business up with, but to help the business understand where the opportunities are to drive an improvement in customer perception and commercial performance.
And now the moment we've been waiting for, the 6 signs of a customer-centric leader. So I think really starting to identify those great leadership practices. And the first that you identified in your piece on the topic is this idea that leaders are constantly talking to customers. And so
yes.
Obviously that's easy to do in some situations. I mean, if you run a store and you're the manager, you just be there, and as customers come in, you talk to them. Even a smaller contact center, I can see, getting on the phone a few times. But as you scale, as your organization grows, I think, it might be more difficult to not only get on the phone or start talking to customers, but choose which ones you should be talking to about which issues. And so I'm wondering if you have any guidance there as far as, yeah, it's great to say that you need to interact with customers, but kind of if you're a leader, where do you sort of start? How do you prioritize that? How do you ensure that this is something you're taking seriously and not just thinking about?
Well, and to be totally honest, Brian, I think to a degree there is a huge amount of fear, the more senior people become, about interacting with customers, and I actually think that to a degree we overthink who we should be talking to. My personal opinion, and my opinion based on what I see around the world, is that it doesn't matter who the customer is, but we need to be actively diarising our ability to go and do what is necessary to hear exactly what it is that customers are saying. Whether it be in a physical face-to-face environment, whether it be picking up the phone, whether it be responding to a complaint that's been written to us, or whether it be us experiencing the journey for ourselves and coming along customers or coming across customers on the way. My view would be is that a customer-centric leader must, in their own right, be interacting with at least one customer every single month, and hopefully many more than that. But it shouldn't be something that is forced. Where I've seen this fail is where it is mandated that leaders do this. I think the key is that a leader must want to do it. If they don't want to do it, then they must question why they're a leader in the first place.
Yeah, and I think frankly it goes to just an understanding because I mean these leaders are going to be expected to not only I think know what's going on with their customers, but train and coach agents to interact with those
Exactly.
customers. And if they don't know what is being said, first of all, they won't be the best possible trainers. They won't be able to adapt to change. And secondly, I wonder if they're going to have a credibility concern because I mean, to
Exactly.
what extent is the front line going to listen to someone who knows nothing about what the customers are actually saying?
Do you know, at the end of the day, can you really make strategic decisions on something that you've never experienced yourself, or you've got no idea how it's done? You know, unfortunately, many businesses do. But if you want to be a genuinely customer-centric leader, you will want to go and find out what's happening, even if it's ugly. You know, it doesn't matter. You've got to know, and then you can make better decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of customer centricity may be an academic process, but the practice is absolutely not academic. There's no one right answer that applies everywhere. There's no singular best
Exactly.
practice that you're going to need to know what your specific customers and your specific agents are doing in order to
Exactly.
really succeed. Now, the second one you talked about, I think, is this commitment to learning about the CX. And in theory, this kind of does tie into what you just talked about. I think this hunger to not just sort of assume that you have all the answers, but instead really focus on evolving as a customer-centric professional and getting a better sense of what the customer
Mm,
experience entails. Now, when you
yes.
talk about learning, what are some sources? Are you talking more about the individual customers within your organization, or are you talking about going out there and seeing what Zappos is doing, seeing what
Yeah.
expert consultants are doing? What's kind of your thinking there?
More the latter. You know, in the last few years, customer experience has become recognized as a profession, and there is now professional qualification in the subject. And ultimately, there are a number of competencies that are required for an organization to possess in individuals and in departments, that if it doesn't possess those competencies, it will find it very difficult to sustain a focus on customer experience. In the last 5 years, I have delivered knowledge transfer sessions to over 5,000 people around the world. And of those 5,000 people, I have had less than a dozen who have come from the C-suite. And the question that I always ask myself is why? Why do so few members of the C-suite ever come to the training? And the conclusions that I come to is that they either know it all already or they don't care. And they don't care enough that they think they need to understand how customer experience can be sustainable. And I think the very fact that so few of us are having constantly brilliant experiences suggests that not enough organizations are possessing the competencies required. So really what I look for in a leader is that there is an acknowledgement that they don't know everything, that there is very likely something that they can learn that will enable them to enhance, improve, adapt their approach to become a more effective leader than they are today. And I always use Amazon as a benchmark when I look at leadership, because Amazon are protagonists of what they call their 14 leadership principles. Principle number 5 of Amazon's principles is described as learn and be curious. Leaders are never done learning and always seek to improve themselves. They are curious about new possibilities and act to explore them. In other words, Jeff Bezos is a believer that a leader never stops learning, and I completely agree.
Yeah, and obviously the core of your message, I think, is certainly valuable. I think that disconnect that leadership often has about what's going on in the world of customer experience could be a problem. But I do wonder if there's another side to the coin, and that is, making sure that in addition to learning, that they're also teaching. Because I think that,
Yes.
while we can often blame leadership for not getting the customer experience, the reality is, I think they're gonna, to some extent, I think there has to be a compromise, and I think the contact center people, the customer experience people, also sort of are best served when they understand how what they do ties into the overall business.
Yes,
So
I
I'm
agree.
wondering if
I
there's
agree.
there you go. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm wondering if there's a role to which the leadership also needs to not only be learning from these people, but coaching them on how what they do ties to the broader business
I
objectives.
agree. I do agree, because I don't want it to always appear that I'm I'm having a downer on leaders. I don't. I think to a degree, if you're not in a leadership position, if you're not on the C-suite, it's difficult to empathize with the pressure that they are put under to achieve financial results. So I think it is a wonderful opportunity for leaders to become a little bit more open and transparent and understand for themselves what they need to be more customer centric, but at the same time, as you rightly say, to educate the business into the things that they need to make happen so everyone can collaborate better together.
Now, collaboration is, interestingly enough, your next sign of a customer-centric leader. And I think that, obviously breaking down silos, working with different departments, that's not really breaking new ground. So I want to instead challenge you, if anything, to identify what it actually takes for a leader to really bring these different departments together, particularly because, I think it's easy, for instance, to say why marketing, sales, customer service, why they need to be customer-centric. But when you're also talking about bringing in HR and IT and accounting that aren't directly customer-facing, I'm wondering, how a great leader kind of also gets them to buy into this mission of customer centricity.
It's tough. There is no doubt about it. But I think that the key word here when it comes to collaboration is ownership. In fact, if I give you an example, I worked for a retailer for 7 years. I was head of group customer experience for a retailer. And one of the things that we measured in that business was the accuracy of the delivery promise, which for an online retailer is a key operational metric. And what I wanted was for one leader in the business to hold their hand up to be ultimately accountable for that metric. And bearing in mind this is a number of years ago, but at the time, no one leader would hold their hand up to become accountable for that one measure, because there were 4 individual leaders who all played a part in the processes that ultimately ended in the product being delivered to the customer. And none of them wanted to take responsibility for anything that was slightly outside of their area of responsibility. So I ended up having to have one measure co-owned by 4 different people. What I'm looking for in 2017 are leaders who are not parochial about their little empire. They recognize that they exist as part of the end-to-end customer journey, and their motivation is not just the little bit that their teams are responsible for, but for the success of the delivery of the whole end-to-end customer journey. Now, again, what I'm saying sounds much easier to say than it is potentially in practice. But what we're looking for are leaders who essentially are existing for the benefit of the whole organization, not just their own personal gain. And what that may mean is that they need to challenge back if the things they are being measured on are not reflective of the whole end-to-end customer journey. If they are only being measured on the performance of the little bits of process that their teams deliver, it makes it very, very difficult for them to go beyond and outside of that. When I look at the most customer-centric leaders in the world, they exist for the benefit of the organization, not for their own personal gain.
And it's interesting because we frankly learn that lesson as kids. I mean, most of us when we're playing sports growing up, there's the whole idea that if one person shows up late to practice, the entire team sprints. And
yes,
it's supposed to be emphasizing the idea of accountability, that ultimately it's about the team winning, and if there's one
Correct.
broken chain, you need to come together to fix it. But somehow it seems like that gets lost when you become a leader in the corporate world, and it's something that really absolutely needs to be reinforced.
Do you know what, Brian? I would say, and I make a lot of bold statements, but in my opinion, it is the overriding reason why most businesses around the world still today deliver what I call random experiences, because they are finding it almost impossible to break down the walls and silos that exist between functional areas. And it requires, in my opinion, a truly transformational leader who is prepared to go outside of their own little comfort zone to bring everyone together that will ultimately succeed. And I believe that Jeff Bezos is a leader like that.
Now, your fourth point really looks at how they measure success. Now, I think there's any number of ways we can go on this, but one thing that I found interesting in your original piece is the emphasis on the voice of the employee. And so, from your perspective, how can a leader create an environment that doesn't simply encourage the sharing of sentiment, but actually confirms and that it's going to be acted on, and then goes ahead and actually acts on it?
Absolutely. And you know, you're right, this could go in a number of different ways, but I think, as you know, and as many of your members know, organizations measure far too many things anyway. And often they measure things that no one ever uses. But we've got to question, what are the most critical pieces of fact that will enable an organization to be sustainably successful, both in the eyes of the business, but also in the eyes of the customer. And listening to what the customer says is obviously critical, but not enough organizations are actively listening to what their own people say, which is voice of the employee. And as you say, it isn't just listening to it, but it is acting on it that is absolutely critical. And so I believe that if a business is able to measure the right things, it can stop measuring a lot of unnecessary things. And too often people ask me, you know, how much is this customer experience thing going to cost us as a business? Well, it's not about spending lots of money. It is about becoming more focused. And what your own people can tell you is what your customers won't tell you. And ultimately, if you can improve the perception of your employees, you will, without question, be able to improve the perception of your customer.
And then, you know, obviously, I want to look at, you know, just in general, whether it's employee satisfaction or customer satisfaction. I think that balance between outcome-oriented metrics versus maybe intermediate ones, because, you know, I think that a lot of organizations will look at retention rate, whether it's agent retention rate or customer retention rate, and as like an example of a metric that speaks to the overall experience, but that may not tell you everything you need to know. I mean, just because a customer's staying around doesn't mean that they're thrilled to be staying around, doesn't mean that they're loyal in the sense that if a better competitor came along, they wouldn't switch. So I'm wondering, you know, how you start, whether you're more a fan of kind of maybe looking at some of the intermediate measures that, while not perhaps that final line on the income statement, may tell you whether you're really in a good place with your agents and customers.
Well, think about these questions. These are the kind of questions that I encourage people to ask and that I ask myself. Do your own people buy your products and services themselves, or in a B2B situation, would they buy your products and services themselves? Have they ever recommended your products and services to anyone else? And if you could ask them how good they think the experience is that you deliver to your customer today, what would they say? And all of those questions are fascinating if they are asked anonymously. It is vitally important, if you're going to capture voice of the employee, that it is done so anonymously. Because if it isn't anonymous, then it is very likely that you will not get a representation of the truth.
Now, another sign you have is, I think, the ability to celebrate quick wins, but also maintain a long-term focus. And, you know, I think, you know, I want to make sure that we contextualize this in a way that isn't just, you know, kind of just give all the leeway in the world and hope things are going to work out for the best. I really want to focus on how you know whether, even if you're not getting these amazing results at the onset, whether an initiative is actually progressing in the right direction, whether it is something worth sticking with over the long term, and when you start to sound the alarm and say, yeah, I'm being patient, but this is just never going to work. I mean, how do you, when can you make that decision about whether it's worth pursuing over the long term?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And again, it connects extremely importantly to the measurement piece, because ultimately this is about driving tangible, demonstrable change. But you've got to have the right measurement in place for that to become a reality. And really, genuinely, it typically takes between 6 and 8 years for an organization to transform itself to become sustainably customer-centric. But there is a big but that I need to add on to that statement. The but being, if the organization remains stable. And so what ultimately the C-suite needs to recognize is that they are never going to see a transformational effect on customer experience in 12 months. Are they going to start seeing a change in in 24 months? Yes. Is it going to be dramatic? No, because it typically takes 6 to 8 years. So if leadership changes on an annual basis, then it is almost impossible for an organization to sustain its focus. And sadly, the reality is still in many corporate organizations around the world that every single year they restructure. And it makes it almost impossible to maintain a focus on anything. So my view would be is that if the measurement is right, you should start to see change within the first 12 months of starting an intentional focus on improving the customer experience. But you will then start to see that change ramp up over time. But you've got to have the right resources in place, you've got to have the budget in place, and there has got to be the commitment to keep going. As soon as it stops, essentially the clock restarts. And very often organizations go all the way back to the beginning again and try and do it all over again.
So if I'm following correctly, the real takeaway here is that it is okay to expect results, fairly quickly, but only if I think you've really made the all-in commitment. You shouldn't, only dabble in it and wait for some magical results to happen. Instead, you have to say, I'm going to commit to this, I'm going to be on board, and now that I'm on board, I've given my organization the chance to succeed, and it really needs to succeed, not cut yourself off at the legs.
Correct. And the simple rule is that whoever the driving force behind the customer experience effort is, whoever it started with, they need to ask themselves, if they left the organization, would the focus on customer experience remain? If it wouldn't, then their focus on customer experience has not been embedded. It is reliant on that individual. If it's embedded, it will no longer be reliant on any one individual. It will have become the way the organization works.
And then your final point, obviously you identify it sort of in writing as walking the talk of customer centricity, but I believe what you're really getting at here is this idea that, if you're expecting your agents to connect with customers, then you as a leader have to connect with your agents. You have to show, I think, an investment in who they are and what they're doing as far as the customer experience. And so, obviously, and this is very much shared within the industry. In fact, as I mentioned, that report we're putting together identifies, I think, the personal connection with leaders as one of the big needle movers when it comes to agent satisfaction. It actually day-to-day means far more than, say, salary, because it really is that lingering, ongoing reflection of how well you value your customers. And so obviously, I think an example you gave was, sitting at lunch and talking to your team members at that point. But scalability is my kind of, concern here, because, obviously if you have a small organization or if you have many leaders, you're able to kind of create the personal connection. But as you start to expand globally, as you start to add at-home workers, what can you sort of do to maintain that, even if you're not maybe eating lunch with them, that you're still connected with them personally?
Absolutely. It does not take a huge amount of time to put something in a diary every week to make the time to do that. Even if it's virtual, to run a half an hour WebEx every Friday morning for all of your home workers, so they've got the chance to say hello. How's your week been? You can do anything if you want to. And too often I see scalability being used as an excuse. The organization's too big, I haven't got the time. But it's not about seeing every single employee every single day. It's about making sure that you make the time to show your people that you care about them. Because ultimately what all customers want is to know that the organization that they're buying something from actually cares about them in a way that they appreciate the fact that we're buying with them. Employees want exactly the same thing. They do not expect a CEO to come and sit at their desk every day. But do they expect a CEO to walk in and say good morning to them? Yes, if they see them. Do they expect a CMO to, tell them what's going on every now and then? Yes. This is not difficult to do It is a state of mind. And if diaries are managed effectively, it doesn't matter how big the organization is, it can be done.
Now, to clarify, when you're talking about sort of making that personal contact, you're talking about it in terms of informal, casual interfacing as opposed to, as a leader, I make sure to set up a Friday coaching session. You know, it's meant to be, I think, just a sign that you care about them in general.
Yes, it can be a combination, but I think it's actually the informal stuff that is often as important, if not more important, than the formal stuff. This is about what I call the human experience. And to be as a customer-centric leader, ultimately, a leader needs to be human. And, you know, we are all people at the end of the day. And a quote that I often use in my training sessions is my favorite business quote of all time from Simon Sinek, who says that 100% of employees are people, 100% of customers are people. If you don't understand people, you don't understand business. And I think it sums this up very well.
It absolutely does. And I think that, you know, I really want to thank you very much, Ian, for kind of sharing your insights with us today, because I think that, you know, obviously it's crazy that we talk about the customer experience as being a differentiator, as being a source of value, and yet so many leaders, I think, do not treat it the same way they would finding out that they have a product that has all kinds of problems, or finding out that, you know, there's some massive, you know, branding controversy or something. And I think that thinking about the day-to-day experience that they're creating for their customers and thinking about the day-to-day experience they're creating for their agents who are responsible for those customers really needs to be an absolute priority. That's what being a leader here is, because no matter how great your vision, no matter how great your product, it's about really putting agents in position both systemically, giving them the tools, but also mindset-wise to really follow through on a great customer experience.
Absolutely right. Totally agree.
Well, and again, you know, so thanks a lot, you know, really appreciate it. And those definitely check out Ian. You know, he had the article on CCW Digital. Also check him out on the web. You know, he is one of the top influencers, and I'm sure after hearing this conversation, you understand why he constantly makes those lists, because he is thinking about not only, I think, what customers are asking for, but what businesses can do to really deliver that. So thanks for being part of this session, Ian. Thanks to those who've listened, and we'll continue with our event.